Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever part of the day you're watching this, it is perfectly fine. Welcome to day 7 of Brian's Winter. Today we are going to read chapters 8 and 9. Yesterday we read chapters 6 and 7, so we're going to keep on pushing with the 2 chapters. Before I get into chapters 8 and 9, I want to quickly do a couple shout-outs. First, I want to shout out, obviously, everybody who's been tuning in so far. We are on chapter 8, which means we are almost halfway through the book already. Can you believe that? Next, I want to do a couple individual shout-outs. First, I want to shout out Kim. Kim has been doing such a wonderful job of not only doing her work, but showing it to Mr. Jones, whether it's in his class, whether it's Mr. Isaac's music work, or Mr. Shields' artwork. Kim is doing such a great job of showing me her work either in messages or on the portfolio on her Class Dojo page. So shout out to Kim. Next, I want to shout out Marcel. Ever since Marcel's gotten his Chromebook set up, Marcel's been doing such a great job of turning in his work, doing his work, asking questions when needed. So shout out to Marcel. And lastly, we have a birthday today. So technically, you won't see this video until tomorrow, April 1st. But today, March 31st, is Siani's birthday. So if you see Siani, you know, we won't see her because we're all. But if you know Siani or if you have her contact information, please reach out to her and tell her happy birthday. You might be a day late because you probably won't see this until tomorrow. But it's the thought that counts. Happy birthday, Siani. So before we get into chapter 8, I want to talk about chapter 6 and 7. So chapter 6 and 7 were the last 2 parts of part 1 of the book, where it was talking about the fall and how it went from summer to fall, and Brian was basically getting prepared for the winter, getting prepared for the cold, and how the forest was going to change and how he was going to have to change as well. So we kind of ended the chapter off thinking about, did all the things Brian do make him prepared for the winter? And that was our prediction. That was our question that we talked about yesterday. Was Brian prepared? Was he prepared? Did he have enough warm clothes? Did he have enough food to survive him if it was too cold to hunt? Did he have enough food to survive because all the animals were going to migrate to the south or go hibernate? Did he have a tight enough shelter to keep the cold air from coming out? Did he have enough weapons to protect himself from animals that are going to be trying to eat him or trying to fight him for his food? So those are the things we kind of talked about and we thought about. So that's what we're going to look forward to in chapters 8 and 9, seeing if Brian is ready to survive the winter, which is just going to be starting in these next 2 chapters. All right, chapter 8. He awakened when he slept enough and looked out the shelter by cracking the door. It was cold and low and gray and rainy. A dismal rain, much like the one that had lasted so long earlier in the fall. And he kindled the fire with dry wood he set aside the night before when he'd seen the clouds moving in. Soon the inside of the shelter was cheery and warm, the smoke working its way out of the hole at the top. And he wished he thought to bring water in the night before, and also wished he didn't have to do what he had to do now. But he couldn't fight it, and at last he pulled himself out of the bag, grabbed the hatchet in the largest aluminum pot, and plunged out into the rain. As fast as possible, standing barefoot on the freezing wet ground, he went to the bathroom and then ran to the lake and chopped his watering hole open. It had frozen thinly overnight, and filled the pan and ran back to the shelter. He slid the door back in place and put the pot on the fire and dropped a piece of venison into it to make a breakfast stew. The meat was getting low. He had stretched the wolf-kill dough as far as he could, trying to ration it and eat smaller amounts, but he'd have to hunt within 4 or 5 days. He put a piece of meat outside the door for Betty, surprised that she wasn't there already, and leaned back to think. In the past few days, it had become colder. The weather had a kind of a steady feel to it, as if it was not going to get warmer, but would stay cold, and he had to face some truths. He simply wasn't ready for cold weather. Oh, he thought, the shelter was all right, and the woods were full of fuel. But his clothing was pitiful. His jeans were holding together, just, but his tennis shoes were about gone. His socks, long since used to shreds, and on top of all that, all he had was a t-shirt and a rabbit-skin vest. I am, he thought, a mess. He was tempted to smile, except that it wasn't really funny. He could sit in the shelter and stay warm, but unless he could hunt, he would die, and he couldn't hunt unless he had something to wear to keep him from freezing. To death, he thought, the truth sliding in like a snake. I could freeze to death. Not quite yet. It wasn't that cold yet, but soon. He didn't know northern winters, but he knew it would get cold enough to kill him and freeze him solid. He took stock again. No clothing, although he still had some rabbit hides, which he could sew in the sleeves for his vest. There was also hide from the doe. He looked at it and thought that he might get a pair of moccasins out of it. They would be crude, but if he stitched them with the hair on the inside and made them big enough to wear over his tattered tennis shoes, they would help. He set to work on what he could do and spent all of that day sewing the rest of the rabbit skins into 2 tubes, which he attached as sleeves to the vest. When he tried it on everything, it crackled as if he were wearing paper. but it seemed to hold together, and he slept that night feeling slightly better about his future. The next morning, he checked the weather. Still raining and colder than it had been the previous morning, and then set to work making footgear. It proved both easier and harder than he had thought it would be. The easy part was making a pattern. He just stood on the dry skin and marked around his foot with a piece of charcoal from the fire pit. When he cut out the two bottoms, he cut two rectangles from the remaining hide and stitched, with some effort as the hide was thick and tough, the two pieces in the rough cylinders. Then he sewed each of the tubes down to the sole, attaching it all around the edge, and when he was done, he had two clunky boots that he could stick his tennis shoes down into. With the hair on the inside, they felt warm the minute he stuck his feet into them. He used the last bits of hide to cut two strips to use for lacing to pull the tops of the cylinders tight to his legs. They hit about mid-calf, and it was here he learned how to soften leather. The deer hide was dried, and working with it was just like working with thin wood. It had no give and was brittle and hard and very, very tough. It was all he could do to sew the cylinders to the bottom using thin-cut hide for lacing and punching holes with the tip of the knife. But the two straps that went around the top had to be soft enough to tie off. He thought of using the fishing line for thread, but didn't want to waste it. Then he found that by working the leather, first between his fingers, and then by pulling it over a piece of wood that stuck out the wall, he could soften it. It never got truly soft and supple like tan deer hide, but it was workable and got the job done. He gathered more wood just before dark and went to sleep that night thinking of punching holes in leather with the tip of the knife. Then an image burned into his mind from sitting all day sewing. Sometime that night near the meadow, it grew quiet and the change awakened him. He listened for a time and realized that the rain had stopped, and he snuggled back in the bag thinking that with no rain, the next day he would hunt. In the morning, he awakened and knew instantly that something changed. Something about the sound. No, the lack of it. There was no sound. Normally he could hear the birds in the morning or the wind rustling. Now there was nothing. He crawled out of the bed and opened the door of the shelter, or tried to. It seemed to be stuck, frozen in place. He pushed harder and finally half stood, crouched, and pushed out with his shoulder against the door. At first it still didn't move, and only when he crouched back and slammed into it with his shoulder did the door fall away, letting him look outside. It nearly blinded him. The entire world was white, bright white, with new morning sun glaring off and through it, and so intense that it made his temples hurt. Snow had fallen in the night, soft, large flakes, nearly 4 inches deep everywhere, on limbs, logs, the ground, on the lake, ice, all over, and even 4 inches. And it was cold, colder than it had been so far. His nostril hairs seemed to stick together when he breathed it, and the air caught in his throat. The world was so incredibly, wonderfully, stunningly beautiful that for a full minute, all he could do was stare. Oh, he had seen pictures of the woods with snow and had seen snow in the park and in the city, but this was different. He was in it, inside the snowy scene, and the beauty of it became a part of him. He stepped outside the shelter, and as he stepped into the snow, realized that he was barefoot. He jumped back inside and put on his tennis shoes and fur boots and the rabbit skin shirt and moved back outside. He had never seen anything so clean. Because it was all new, there wasn't a mark, not a track in the surface of the snow, and he took 4 or 5 paces just to look back at his tracks. It's like a Bigfoot, he said aloud, and indeed the boots left a large, rounded hole for a footprint. He moved around, did his toilet, drawing a picture in the snow when he did it. Ew. It was amazed how well the boots worked. He kept his feet warm and comfortable. As he came close to the shelter, he saw a mouse appear almost magically out of the snow, run across the surface for 3 feet, and then dive under again. Brian moved to where the mouse had run and studied his tracks, little dots in a parallel line with a small line in the middle where the tail dragged. But clean, he thought, and neat, and so easy to see and follow in everything. Everything that moved in the woods would leave tracks, would be easy to see, would be easy to follow, would be much easier to hunt. He still had some venison left, but he decided to hunt. Because the snow was new and he never hunted in snow, because the sun was bright and fresh, because his clothing seemed to work, he decided to hunt. And it was in this way that he found the moose. And that's the end of chapter 8. So what we kind of saw in this chapter was Brian got his first piece of winter as it got super duper cold, and he also got some snow. So basically we see how the elements and how the setting is affecting Brian already right off the bat in the winter. So with that, I want to use that to pose my first 2 questions for this read aloud. The first question I want to talk about is, in what ways will the winter make life harder for Brian? So We know it's cold. We know it's snowing. We know all these things that winter is going to cause for the forest. In what ways will this make life harder for Brian until he gets rescued? And then the second question is just to build up off of that. It's the same deal, but just a different question. What ways will the winter make life easier for Brian? So even though there's snow, even though it's colder, even though all these changes are happening because of winter, there's still some things that the winter might actually help Brian now that it's colder, now that it's snow on the ground, or now that the weather's changed. These things could help Brian in the forest and help him survive. So what are some ways that the winter will help Brian and help make his life easier until he gets rescued? So those are the questions for chapter 8. You can pause here before you get to the next video, answer those questions, or you can just chug on along to chapter 9 and do all the questions together.